Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 1. Today we are moving from hunting and gathering to the development of civilization. The thing that will make that possible is agriculture. Over the course of this lecture, you will come to understand the connection between civilization and agriculture. You also will encounter a number of terms and questions that you should be able to answer by the time you get to the final slide. So once again, please take good notes while you're listening to this lecture. Make sure you also take down other items that you think might help you to better understand the topic. And once again, please, if you have questions, come see me or email me or ask me in class. I want to make sure that this is as clear as possible. So anyway, let's get started. What have we discussed so far? We have discussed how modern humanity is linked to the evolution of Homo sapiens, an event that occurred somewhere between 200,000 and 150,000 years ago. We have discussed how Homo sapiens first evolved in Africa, and how they didn't stay there for long. Instead, about 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to migrate out of Africa and onto other continents around the globe. These early humans were what we now call hunter-gatherers. In other words, they got their food by hunting wild game and by gathering wild plants. The world of a hunter-gatherer was very different from our world today. A few of the things we have discussed included the fact that hunter-gatherers did not live in large cities. In fact, their bands were no more than 25 to 30 people. They carried very, very few possessions with them, really only the things that they absolutely needed to survive. We learned that they moved around a lot. They often followed herds of animals, or they had to move from one place to another to avoid exhausting supplies of edible roots and berries and other plants. Finally, we discussed how many hunter-gatherer cultures are roughly equal, how they share most wealth within the society, largely because all peoples are critical to the survival of that group, and so therefore they can't afford to give too much power or authority to any one individual. Everyone is of equal importance. Around 10,000 years ago, however, something changed. This change is perhaps the greatest invention in the history of humanity. The invention is agriculture. Agriculture is defined as the systematic production of food. In other words, rather than relying on gathering wild berries and roots to provide food for human groups, these groups learned that they could intentionally plant food such as grains, fruits, and vegetables. Rather than hunting wild game, they could domesticate and raise animals, such as sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, just to name a few. The result was a dramatic increase in food production. That's because agriculture is far more reliable when it comes to providing food than hunting and gathering. And think about it. If you are raising livestock, you know exactly where they are. You don't have to chase after them. The same is true about crops. You don't have to hunt for a field of wheat or a field of rye. If you planted it, you know where it is. And so therefore, you can raise far more food. You can provide a far more reliable diet using agriculture than you could using hunting and gathering. But agriculture resulted in more than simply increasing the food supply. It also led to the development of what we call civilization. In fact, it is not too great a statement to say that agriculture created civilization. Historians often speak of an agricultural revolution, as though it was a single event that occurred in one spot at one time and then spread around the globe. But that's not accurate. In fact, the agricultural revolution occurred independently at many spots around the world at different times. Some of those spots include the Indus River Valley in India, the Yellow River Valley in China, the Supe River Valley in Peru, and Mesopotamia, which is now part of Iraq and Syria. This map shows the development of agriculture at different spots around the world. But what is really interesting about this map is that it also shows that the agricultural revolution occurred between 10,000 and 3,000 years ago. Historians do not believe this was a coincidence, that it occurred at roughly the same time in human history. In other words, historians suspect that something happened around the world during this time that made agriculture possible. But what was it? The answer, many believe, is climate change. The last ice age, a period of global cooling that led much of the northern hemisphere to be covered in ice and snow, ended about 12,000 years ago. Climate change is thought to have been the key factor that made agriculture possible. As the climate warmed, growing seasons became longer. Moreover, the gigantic glaciers began to pull back, and melting water from the glaciers formed lakes and rivers. Which sort of makes you think about the impact climate change might have on our own society today. This map shows the possible impact that climate change might have on our world. Should the climate continue to warm, it could disrupt food supplies for millions of people around the world. Most of those people live in the poorer nations of South America and Africa. This should leave you asking questions about climate change and the common good. But let's save that discussion for later. In terms of history, the rise of agriculture had a major impact on humanity. One of the biggest changes was the rise of cities. In short, agriculture makes cities possible. One of the oldest of those cities, discovered by archaeologists, was a city called Çatalhöyük, which rose sometime around 7500 BCE. It is thought that the population of Çatalhöyük varied between 5,000 and 10,000 people. Çatalhöyük is located in what is now Turkey. But what is the connection between agriculture and the rise of cities? One thing has to do with the nature of agriculture itself. If you plant a field of wheat or barley, it has to be tended. Someone has to weed the fields and keep animals from eating the crops. Later, the crops have to be harvested, and excesses have to be stored for another year or for the future planting. The same was true for herds of domesticated cattle and pigs. They had to be tended. This required people to stay in one place, and this meant that cities could develop. On a related note, humans also had to stay in one place to protect their crops and herds from others who might want to take them. As I said earlier, the city of Çatalhöyük was between 5,000 and 10,000 people. While that might seem small to us today, it is a huge increase over the 25 to 30 people who usually inhabited hunter-gatherer bands. So why did agriculture make it possible for humans to sustain larger and larger populations? Well, that's easy. Agriculture makes it possible to raise more food than hunting and gathering. We already said that. More food means more people. This is a lesson we will relearn throughout this semester. But the changes did not stop with larger populations. Once a community grew to depend on the food produced by agriculture, it became necessary to figure out a way to distribute that food. It was also necessary to ensure that enough grain from the harvest could be set aside for the next year's planting. Finally, not every year was a good one. Civilizations quickly learned that a portion of the harvest should also be stored in case of drought or natural disaster. To handle these problems, governments and legal codes were developed. For example, one of the oldest legal codes in Western civilization is the Code of Hammurabi. This code covers many items, including slavery, water rights, and the sale of beer. It also covered the care of animals. This passage, for example, governed those who tended animals for others. Quote, if a herdsman to whose care cattle or sheep have been entrusted be guilty of fraud and make false returns of the natural increase, or sell them for money, then shall he be convicted and pay the owner 10 times the loss. So in other words, this is telling you how relations between human beings should be governed. If one person should wrong another, what would be the avenue of recourse? What would someone have a right to do? So the Code of Hammurabi, or the development of agriculture, I should say, is going to make it necessary for laws and governments to develop. One thing that might surprise some who are new to the study of early civilization is the connection between agriculture and religion. Historians do not believe that agriculture created religion. Hunter-gatherer groups had a rich spiritual life that included many gods and rituals. What historians do argue, however, is that agriculture did lead to the creation of organized religion. Organized religion refers to a structure of belief that includes permanent temples and houses of worship. It also refers to a class of people whose full-time job is to tend to those temples and to worship those gods. So why? Why does agriculture make this necessary? Well, it has to do with nature. The gods were thought to be in control of nature, and nature was critical to an agricultural society. You couldn't simply pick up your city and move just because of a long drought or destructive floods. Thus, to improve your odds, you needed to keep the gods that controlled nature happy. To do this, you needed a group of priests who organized worship and followed the proper rituals to keep the gods satisfied. And if the gods were satisfied, life would be good. The religions of many of the early civilizations shared numerous things in common. Many of these early civilizations were polytheistic, for example. This meant that they believed in more than one god. Typically, these gods were connected to nature in one way or another. For example, the Babylonians, the same people who created the Code of Hammurabi, worshipped the following gods. An was the god of the sky. Enlil was the god of the wind. Enki, the god of rivers and waters. Then Husaga, the goddess of the soil, the mountains, and vegetation. And there were others as well. Agriculture also led to the development of socially stratified societies. Remember, hunter-gatherer cultures were roughly egalitarian. That meant that everyone was equal because everyone was needed to hunt or gather food for the group. With the development of agriculture, however, fewer people were needed to grow food for the population. This freed up some people to develop other tasks or other jobs. For example, some became artists. Some became professional merchants. Some became government officials, and as we said before, some became priests. Now, over time, not all of these groups were considered to be equal. Farmers, for example, were often going to be put down towards the bottom of society. They were raising food for those who were above them, those who were wealthier in society. And so agriculture makes it possible, I guess I should say, for stratified societies to develop. Societies, in other words, where not everyone was equal. Finally, agriculture also led to the development of writing. Why? Civilizations had to figure out some way to know how much grain or how many animals they needed to feed the population, and how much they could afford to trade away. They needed to find a way to track weather and flooding patterns, so that they knew when to plant and when to harvest. Over time, they developed written symbols that over time became letters. One of the earliest forms of writing was known as cuneiform, and it was developed by a people known as the Sumerians. Cuneiform was carved into wet clay tablets, many of which still survive to this day. In conclusion, agriculture led to the complete transformation of human society. In many ways, from the development of cities and governments to the need for organized religion and writing, agriculture is responsible for the development of many of the things that still characterize our society today. That's it for this lecture. Now we're going to move on to a new topic.